My name is Derek. I had the article, Does Video Recording Inhibit Crime Suspects? Evidence from a Fully Randomized Trial Experiment. So, beginning with the introduction, the authors look at false confessions. There's been many calls for reforms. As we read in the other articles, false confessions are very detrimental to the aspect of justice. Miscarriages of justice happen quite frequently in our system. A lot of these were initially studied with vulnerable populations, such as elderly, juveniles, people with mental health issues. So there's been significant calls to reform these types of systems. One of the issues that many researchers identified is these confrontational tactics. The investigative interview doesn't necessarily employ, but still gets the same results. And the confrontational tactics typically lead to even innocent people confessing, which is a fairly common phenomenon when you're in high pressure situations such as interrogations. The white paper we looked at talked about requiring electronic recordings of interrogations. They want the entire process. It's become commonplace to record confessions, but it has not become commonplace to record interrogations. The calls for reform would try to change this. At present, 25 states in the District of Columbia require video recording. 25 states do not. The FBI only recently began to employ these types of federal mandates for recording the entire custodial interrogation process. There's good policy and then there's good practice. The many organizations favor mandating recording, and in surveys given to law enforcement agencies, it's actually been shown to be a very supported concept. People who advocate for this type of policy typically point to that you can attend to a suspect, you don't have to take notes. You can pull the recording back up and review the session for incriminating statements that you might have missed. As well, reduces the need for detectives to defend their interrogation practices because they're able to show them on video to what actually happened. Others have opposed recording, either on pragmatic grounds or some moral reasons. Initially, one of the issues is financial costs. Then you look at evidentiary consequences, and then there's these ideas of failures to comply. So if an individual is given the ability to choose whether or not they're being recorded, which is their right, then many of them may choose to invoke their Fifth Amendment right to silence and not actually participate in the interview, which is a big worry of law enforcement agencies. It's that issue of consent in many states as well. There's a two-party versus one-party consent, and you have to ask for the other party's consent, and if you don't get it, then you can't participate in that. So it's just a big concern right now about how video recording would affect police, judges, and juries. If we look at the actual effects, a 2014 study tested the hypothesis that recording would reduce psychologically coercive tactics, such as minimization and maximization. It did show support for this. Police officers who were recorded typically used less techniques like minimization and maximization, which has been shown to influence false confessions fairly frequently. In a 2017 study, moving on, officers in a mock crime scene reported the crime scene to a independent third party, and they were given two options, either the written report or a transcript. Typically, the written report showed a type of implicit bias where the officers were presented in a less pressure-filled light, whereas if you read the transcript, people would view that as a pressure-filled situation and maybe coercive. So then the lingering concern is this idea that will the camera distract or inhibit the suspect? And if it did, then they would possibly invoke their Miranda rights, their Fifth Amendment right to silence. Self-awareness theory sort of justifies this concern by examining this baseline self-awareness, where you enter into the interview, you see the camera, you see a mirror or reflective substance, and it causes you to enter into an attentional state where you are more likely to be reluctant to give incriminating information. Alternatively, there's the idea that this isn't necessarily what happens. You're already at a baseline high level of self-awareness because you're entering into a room with detectives and interrogators. There is usually an audience because of this, even if it's behind a two-way mirror, you might know. And then there's another proposed idea, which is the habituation effect. So as we repeatedly expose witnesses or suspects to these cameras, they will, in effect, become used to the stimuli because it's repeated, and it won't be so much of an issue. There's an idea that stems from when they introduced TV cameras to mock jurors, how they felt about that. So if we move on to an overview of the current study, if you test the hypothesis, recording suspects in their behavior will alter their forthcomingness or their truthfulness or their willingness to participate. This study looked at real suspects. They used a city police department in a small U.S. Northeast city. Records show that the policy for this department is to record all capital offenses that might come with a life sentence. Many of the other interrogations were also recorded. It was a one-party consent state, which is important later. This state did not require two parties to consent, only one. And then it was a fully randomized field experiment. Moving into the methods, 122 suspects brought into custody, randomly assigned some conditions and not others, and the recording was a concealed camera, typically two, one in the corner, one behind a mirror. There was a lead detective. They were intended to run the study as blind, as well as ideally two secondary detectives who also would be running it as blind. The third detective would ideally administer the condition if there was not a neutral third-party colleague that they could get to do that. So all of the recordings were made in transcriptions, and they were examined for the frequency of gazing in the direction of the camera, those who invoke Miranda rights, duration of the interrogation, and then the length and time and or word count of the interrogation. Everybody in question was an adult. They had, as a post-session questionnaire, the detectives filled out information regarding, did they feel like it was blind? What was the truthfulness of the individual? Did they feel like they were forthcoming? Did they feel like that they were self-conscious of the camera? They got IRB approval for this. That comes into play later with the juveniles. And they did not code for interrogation tactics used. They were actually reached an agreement with the police department not to code for that. And then they used a 1-year sample collection, about 14 months, of this small northeastern U.S. city, one-party consent, looking at life sentences. There were 14 detectives in total. They came from major crimes. There were no drug crimes or confidential informants used. The IRB approved the use of adults but not juveniles. There was no homicide cases included because the officers that went after those cases felt that they were so high stakes they did not want to participate in the study. Therefore, a total of 127 interrogations were conducted. 3 sessions actually involved invoking non-Mirandized witnesses, and repeat sessions were not counted. So in total, there's only 122 actual cases in the data set. They were split up into major and minor crimes. Minor could range from a prank phone call to disorderly conduct. Major could range from child abuse to any other felony that's possible. The equipment was, as mentioned earlier, 2 cameras, one concealed behind a mirror, one in the corner of the room. They used a software called Case Cracker, which allowed them to record and send to an external screen so they could monitor and hear the sound. Case Cracker does prevent people from pausing and starting recordings. If you stop a recording, it's saved with time and date. This is another technique to prevent interrogation tactics, such as pausing the video, asking leading questions, and then resuming it to try to get what you want. If you look at the setup, we have a primary detective, the lead investigator. We have a secondary and preferably a third investigator. Prior to the start of data collection, the authors trained the detectives in the study protocol. The protocol involved using a neutral third-party colleague to start the interrogation. They would read from a condition paper that was handed to them in an envelope, and this condition would be what they introduced to the suspect. If it was a camera condition, they would walk in, let the suspect know they were being recorded, point to where the cameras were, walk out, and the detectives would walk back in. When asked in the post-questionnaire survey, if the detectives felt like it was blind, 59.32% of the primary said they were blind. Using this criteria and consulting video evidence, then it's estimated that roughly 90% were blind. The authors state that this is most likely an over calculation and overestimation of the amount that were actually blind, since underreporting most likely occurred. One suspect was informed of the condition. The primary and the secondary would enter. Then once it was concluded, they would conduct the survey after. The dependent measures looked at were, as indicated before, forthcoming, truthfulness, cooperativeness, relaxed, inhibited, noxious, talkative, self-conscious on a 1 to 10 Likert scale. They also wanted to know if it was the first time being questioned, if they were aware that they were being recorded, and they expressed the belief that they knew they were being recorded. They also wanted to know about manipulations. Recording was then de-identified and transcribed by a third-party service. After this, it was then coded to certain points, which were glance at camera, length of interrogation, relative number of words spoken, whether or not people invoked their Miranda rights, a few others. This presented a slight issue. For instance, glance at camera was initially coded by people who were not blind. They knew the condition going into the coding. So new coders were retrained to alleviate this in a blind condition format. It didn't seem to matter much. The condition still stood and the agreeableness was still there. Results. Camera awareness. 35 out of 64 of the camera-informed parties, the breakdown was 64 interrogations knew they had a camera. 58 didn't know they had a camera. 35 out of 64 of that condition, the officers pointed to the camera. In the instructions for the actual protocol, officers were told to point to the camera at the beginning if they were to inform the suspect. Only roughly half did, something to bear in mind. Suspects were unlikely to glance at the camera if they were uninformed, but not more likely if they were informed. Just a hair more. Suspects that did glance at the camera was few, and they only had 3 people ask about the recording, and of those 3, not a single one of them invoked the Miranda rights. On average, each interrogation took around 25 minutes. In 2 instances, individuals invoked their Miranda rights. In about 15% total, at some point in the interrogation, suspects invoked their right to silence. There is currently no support within this framework that shows recording would affect waiver rates. Most everybody waived their rights at the beginning of the interrogation. Looking at degrees of self-incrimination, we can see that most everybody, around 80%, denied involvement of guilt. They did this about 6 times. Both groups were equally likely to do this at least once. There was roughly 30% admission of guilty knowledge by both groups. 10% made explicit admissions, so they actually outright said it. 24% made an admission and then a narrative, like a confession, saying they did it. And around 35% of both groups made no self-incriminating remarks. The difference between the camera-informed group and the non-camera-informed group in terms of guilty knowledge was only around 10 to 20%. So if you look at the issue of training new coders to perhaps maybe that these numbers are biased, the authors did this, and after showing them 20 transcripts, discussing disagreements, and showing them 20 more, they actually came to about a 70% agreement rate in terms of self-incrimination. And they also perfectly were in line with saying that people who did self-incriminate did so with an admission. They might not know to what degree that admission is, if it's a full confession or partial confession, but they did agree that they made it. So then, moving forward, the new hypothesis comes to light. What if these camera recordings inhibited individuals from implicating others? Only about 3 cases did individuals actually say that they didn't want to implicate others on camera. 47% of suspects in the uninformed versus around 37% of the informed was the difference, and it's only around 10%, so it's not much. Both groups were similar in their implication of others during the crime. As well as if you look at minimization of culpability, 47% of all suspects minimized. On average, there was about 1 minimization remark and the camera didn't seem to affect this. Both groups were similar. In terms of level of detail, there was typically like 14 crime-related, non-incriminating events, and 50% of the information was usually non-relevant, non-incriminating. In terms of extraneous behaviors, which were also monitored, 88, almost 89% of interrogations ended with didn't end, but the detective left at some point. When the detective left, 27% of those individuals talked to themselves, and an interesting 31 suspects throughout the entirety cried, so about 25%. In terms of detectives' perceptions of suspect, there was no overall difference in detectives' perceptions. They still viewed each suspect as relatively talkative, moderately truthful, moderately forthcoming. And then following these cases, 14 months after collection, 100 cases had resolved. Roughly half had gone to guilty or pleas. 2 had gone to trial, and 52 were found not guilty because they did not want to charge the suspect. Moving into finally the discussion. First, this was the first fully randomized field experiment involving interrogations of real crime suspects. Results did not support claims that cameras would interfere with interrogations or have inhibitory effects. Suspects showed little awareness. They had little difference in their extraneous behaviors. And it echoes the incorporation of videotaping for confessions. So in 1975, Bronx, New York District Attorney introduced a mandate that required recording of all confessions. The same arguments were brought up. It would invoke Miranda rights. People would be reluctant. Only 1% of individuals refused to be videotaped. Most people did not have a problem with it and did not see the camera as an issue for them. If you look at the bulk of these interrogations, most of them took 30 minutes to an hour. The most was around 2. There's no evidence that anybody saw the camera and wanted to invoke their Miranda rights. Most, if not all, waived their rights at the very beginning. So the substance showed that both groups offered guilt similarly. There was no significant differences in crime-relevant details, and nearly half of self-incriminating suspects used minimization. So this is important with the idea that this study echoes the real-world situation, which is they told some people that they had to be recorded, and they told some people they didn't have to be recorded. In a one-party consent state, you don't have to let people know you're being recorded, but there are a lot of states that use two-party consent rules, and they have to know. So it's not a laboratory setting for this. This is a legitimate policy that researchers and practitioners are going to have to compensate with when they try to introduce recording to these processes. Some states have different methods and different requirements, so it's good to understand how it affects both. If you look at limitations, however, you can see that the hidden camera nature of this study means that maybe individuals being able to see the camera could lead to more reluctance to share. As well, there was no homicide cases, which are some of the most plagued cases when it comes to miscarriages of justice. And there's no drug in juveniles, which could easily present different stories. The authors did identify the issue of blind coding, and they attempted to rectify it. It could still play an issue, but it's also trying to be tackled by these groups. If you look at policy implications, researchers have shown that this fear of recording and invoking Miranda rights because you feel like you're being recorded isn't founded, and it seems like the pros outweigh the cons currently. Recording individuals in the custodial interrogation process will only seek to benefit the system currently, and it doesn't seem to stop justice from happening. So that's the main idea. Thank you.